Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio and welcome back to our Metroidvania in Unity tutorial series. So far in this series we've got a lot of states for our player, we've got spells, and I'm about ready to start on combat. That said, I've had a lot of requests for a couple more player states before we move on. And so in our next two videos, we're going to be adding a wall jump and wall slide mechanic. Let's get started. Alright, so the very first thing we're going to do is actually just create our animation. So let's drag our animation pane up from the bottom here. I'm going to make sure that we are clicked on the sprite of our player, and now we can create a new animation. We'll call this one wall jump, and then I'll just make sure that I put it in my animations folder. If you're working with Brolov's generic character pack, this is going to be in the second sprite sheet, and we don't officially have an actual wall jump. However, we do have these four sprites here that sort of look like he is pushing off from the wall, and I think those will work just nicely for initiating a jump away from the wall. Back in Unity then, we can shift-click all four of those sprites and drag them up into the animator. We want that last frame to last just as long as the others, so we're just going to make an extra copy of it so that it doesn't end immediately. And then obviously this is pretty fast, so let's drag it out over more like 20 frames, and that's looking pretty good. At this point we can head it to our animator and set up our transition, and this one's going to be just a little different as the wall jump doesn't actually animate the jump. We just want to play the wall jump and then sort of go into our normal jump. So to do this, I'm just going to create a transition to the wall jump and then from there into our jump state and specifically to the jump animation. On the transition going into wall jump now, we are going to need a new parameter. So let's make a bool. We can call this one is wall jumping. And we just want to head into this state whenever is wall jumping is true. Now for our exit, we don't actually need to wait for this to be set false. All we need to do is play the entire animation. So we'll give it a 1 for exit time. Make sure it has no duration. Alright, just like that, our animator's set up and we're ready to start coding. I'm going to begin by creating a player wall jump state. Alright, so here's the plan. We're just going to code the bare basics of the player wall jump right now. Let's get rid of start and update. That way we can test it by setting up our transitions from our other states and making sure things are working before we get too deep into the code. Alright, don't forget to make sure that your player wall jump is inheriting from player state. And then down below, we're going to create our constructor. It'll be a public player wall jump state. It's just going to have to take in a reference to our player. That way it has access to all of those variables and methods in our player script. And then it also has to pass the player along to the base state so that it also has access to those things. All right, let's begin with our public override enter method. And the first thing we want to do, as always, is set our animator's bool for is wall jumping to true. At this point, we're just going to give our player some velocity. Now, the first thing I like to do here is bring it to a complete halt. So we'll set our linear velocity to a vector2.0, which will just give him a nice snappy pause just momentarily before he actually jumps off the wall. Next, let's actually set the velocity for the jump. So we'll set our linear velocity to, and here we need to construct a new vector. And it's essentially just going to be the opposite of the direction we're facing because we're looking at the wall right now. So we'll take the negative or inverted version of our player's facing direction. And then for our y, we're just going to put a 1 here. That way it will always go upward. We can then multiply it by our player's jump force. It'll be just as strong as our normal jump. Now, this is going to be a little wonky at first. Don't worry about it. We'll improve and finesse this a little bit later on. All right, now we've got the bare bones. Let's actually activate this by heading over to our player jump state. At the moment, our jump state is a sort of multi-purpose in-air state. Anytime we hit the jump button, we go into our jump state. And so this is going to be where we're always going to come from if we're wall jumping, as you won't wall jump when you're standing on the ground. So at the moment, the only way we leave jump state is to actually land on the ground and have a velocity that's no longer going upward. Let's head up above this and just add another check. So here we're going to check to see if jump has been pressed. And here we're going to go to our player and we're going to need to call a method that doesn't exist yet, as we need to check whether or not our player is currently touching a wall. If that is the case, we're just going to tell our player to change state to the player wall jump state, which if we went back into Unity, we'd be getting an error as our player doesn't yet know about the wall jump state. We'll fix that in just a second, but first, let's make sure that this second statement is an else if, so that our code doesn't try to evaluate this statement if the first one is already true. And finally, just make sure that we spell this right, as it's not called touchin' wall, it is touching. All right, let's head over to player. So our first step here in player is just to make it aware of the player wall jump state. So we'll add a public state for that, and we'll just call this one wall jump state. We can then head right on down to our awake method, where we'll make our wall jump state equal to a new player wall jump state and pass along this script. Next, we're going to need to prepare some variables and references so that we can actually check if we're touching a wall. Let's make a header called wall check, and very similar to our ground check, we'll give it a transform for the wall check, which is where our check will originate from. We'll then have a float for our wall check radius, just how much space we want to actually check. Let's initialize it to 0.15, though we can tweak that later in Unity. We'll also need a layer mask so that our player actually knows what counts as walls. And finally, we're going to want to keep a public bool that just keeps track of his state so that if he is in fact touching a wall, the player knows about it. Now this is more or less our ground check all over again, so let's just come down below that, make our check for walls method, and then we'll just make sure that our isTouchingWall bool is constantly being set to the findings of an overlap circle. So here it'll originate at our wall check position, be the size of our radius, and always be looking for a wall layer. If it actually hits wall layer within that radius, it'll set isTouchingWall to true, and if it can't find any wall, it'll set it to false. We can then draw a gizmo so that we can debug this inside of Unity and actually see how big this is and where it's showing up. And it's really just going to be our ground check again, except this time let's make it green and make sure that we set it to draw where our wall check position is and use our wall check radius. All right, we're close now, but we're not actually ever checking if there's walls in front of us. So let's head to fixed update, and like our grounded method, we'll call the check for walls here so that our player's constantly setting that isTouchingWall to true or false. We can then come on down to our onJump method, as we're going to want to tweak this just a little bit. Currently, our jump pressed variable can only actually be true if we are pressing jump, we're on the ground, and there is no ceiling above us. However, now we want to add another situation. So we'll put the OR sign here. And now if we press the button and we're touching a wall, we want to be able to set jump press true, as that will be what triggers our wall jump. All right, back in Unity, let's make sure that we click on our player, and then we can scroll down in our player script and just find that wall check region. Here we want to make sure that we set our wall layer. For now, my ground is the only thing that counts as a wall, but later on I might add other things I can wall jump off, and this layer check allows us to do that. Now we don't actually have a wall check yet, so while clicking on the player, let's create an empty and call it wall check. I'm going to set this one over in front of my player, kind of where his hand is on the shield. We'll then go back to player and make sure to drag the wall check into that transform box. Now, I'm a little nervous about how small I made this wall check radius. I'm going to go with 0.5, but feel free to play around with that and try to get it just right. All right, so when I get in the game now, I can go to the wall, jump off it, and the jump's a little weird, and afterwards I can't actually leave this state, but it does seem like it's working. Now, if for some reason your player didn't wall jump and you're just doing a normal jump off the wall, probably means that your ground check radius is a little too large. We'll address this later in the video, so don't get too stressed about it. All right, let's keep coding this state. If we head back to player wall jump state, while still in enter, we want to make sure that as soon as we've initiated the jump, we consume that jump pressed reference. Additionally, we want to set jump release to false. This is going to be important as we want to be able to hold down the button in order to jump a little higher, like we do with our normal jump state. Now we can head on down, and we're going to create our public override update method. I call mine enter here, which is a little bit painful. I do fix it later on, but for now, just bear with me. Now we definitely need a way to actually leave this state, and so in update, we want to constantly be checking if we have pressed the button and if our player is touching the wall. So if that is the case, then we want to change state to our player wall jump state. Essentially, we just want to re-enter this state because it means that we've hit another wall and we're pressing the button. Now, we want to have a way to actually just get out of this altogether, so we'll also add an else if. And here we're really just going to mirror what happens in our jump state. If our player is grounded and our velocity is not going upward anymore, then we want our player to change state back to the player idle state. Next, let's make sure that our physics are working properly, so we're going to use our public override fixed update method this time around. And here we first of all just want to apply variable gravity. This is that method back in our player that makes it so that we have slightly different gravity on the way up versus on the way down, so our jump feels more responsive. Next, we want to get that feel right on our jump based on whether or not we're holding down the button. So if jump is released and our linear velocity is greater than 0, meaning we're still on the way up, then we want to take our rigid body's linear velocity and we'll just construct a new vector 2. We don't want to do anything to our x here, so we'll just leave the linear velocity for the x the same. However, for our y, we want to take our current linear velocity, but multiply it by our jump cut multiplier. Once we've done that, we will have consumed the jump release, and so we want to make sure jump release gets set false. That way we don't continuously apply the jump cut multiplier, but just that one time. At this point, we can finally make our public override exit method where we're just going to set our anim's bool for is wall jumping back to false so that he knows he's done the state. Now at last, I'll come back up here where I notice that I called my update method enter, and we'll just fix that to actually say update. This is also the happy moment that I realized that in my check here, I didn't do player velocity y, I just did velocity in general, which doesn't work. Now this next part could look a little different depending on how things are set up. It could be that your wall jump works just great here, or that it works the very first time. You can see that mine just plain isn't working. My player is jumping when I touch the wall, but it's a normal jump, not a wall jump. This one took me a second to figure out, and you can see some debugging in the console, but essentially what's happening here is if you look at my ground check circle, you'll notice that it's really large. It actually goes past my feet, which is why my player thinks he's always on the ground when he's actually touching a wall. So if I just make that into a smaller circle, my wall touch will actually work and the ground check won't. You just want to make sure that your ground check is set to pretty much the exact same size as your collider, as you don't want to have a situation where your collider is holding you over a cliff, but your ground check isn't noticing the ground, and so your player thinks he's not on ground when he's hanging off a cliff. That said, if you get them just right, things should work great. And you can see here now with mine that I'm in fact wall jumping quite nicely now, except that the wall jump is pretty violent, so let's improve that. Alright, so currently when we set our wall jump velocity, we're just doing a opposite of the player's facing direction, so a 1 or -1 for the x and a 1 for the y, which means we're applying just as much pressure horizontally as we are vertically. The problem is our vertical push has to fight gravity and the horizontal doesn't, so it really should be a lot lighter horizontally. So to fix this up top, I'm just going to make a float called horizontal jump percent. I'm going to set mine to 0.5, but you can try different numbers, and essentially if we multiply this by our x value, we'll just get a cut version of our horizontal movement, in my case 50% as much power. And back in Unity when I jump now, it's looking a whole lot better. Now one little note, you'll notice that when I jump, my player doesn't automatically turn around. To me that kind of makes sense, he's pushing off from the wall and so he shouldn't turn unless the player tells him to. That said, if this is really bugging you, let me know in the comments, and perhaps in the next video I'll just show how to set up a flip so that he auto changes direction. That said, we've got a wall jump, it's working pretty nicely, and in the next video we're going to add some wall sliding. Hope you found this one helpful. I'm excited to be wrapping up the player controller so that we can get into some combat in our next few videos after the wall slide. Hope to see you in that one. Until then, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.